Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, reviewing today this longsword made by Swordier. Now, a couple quick disclaimers here. I did not buy this sword. It was sent to me by Swordier for purposes of this review. If you think that makes me biased, at least you know ahead of time. The other disclaimer is that I don't practice historical European martial arts. I don't practice any martial arts. I am an amateur cutter. I am slowly competing and trying to improve at cutting, but I don't have actual knowledge of how swords were used historically. I have little tidbits of information I've gathered here and there. What I do have is a lot of experience handling swords and reviewing them. So to keep that in mind, my review is more of the average person's experience with the longsword as opposed to somebody who is an expert. Now, this sword sells new for $199. If you would like to buy one of them, I put a link in the description. There's no tracking or kickbacks to me if you happen to buy one through that link. So this sword at $199 is very much in the budget price range. You can't get much of a European longsword for really much cheaper than that. You might be able to find them in the $150 range occasionally, but $200 is really where the budget range starts for long swords. When you're talking about budget range swords, you always have to expect compromises. It's pretty much always a study in what compromises were made to make this fit the budget, and how does that affect the sword's ability to be a sword. So that's what I go into budget-oriented sword reviews. That's the mentality I take into them is, what are the compromises? Is the sword still a good sword despite those compromises? So Swordier markets this one as an Oakshot Type 16A. And I think overall they did a pretty good job mimicking that. Now the hilt is probably too long. The furniture is definitely not really inspired by 16A, which typically had much more simpler furniture, almost always a wheel pommel. But the blade profile is pretty accurate to a 16A, and certainly more accurate to European longswords than the previous Swordier longsword I reviewed, which really did look and feel like a Gian blade mounted in a European style. This blade profile looks much more European in origin, so that's a good thing to see. The scabbard that comes with this sword is quite ornate for the $200 price. It's got this leather with a pre-stamped pattern on it that's kind of floral themed. That kind of goes with the rest of the fittings on the sword as well. And it's a little much for my taste because it goes throughout the entire scabbard because it is a pre-stamped pattern. So while the pattern looks nice, it looks mass manufactured. It doesn't have that bespoke look to it that you get with hand tooling. Now, obviously at $200, you're not going to get hand tooling. That's outrageous to even think of that. So it works, it looks nice, just not to my taste. There is a seam right here on the side, and it's prominent, but the stitching seems pretty well done. The leather on here, it does move around a slight amount, not too much, but it could use to be glued a little bit better. There's a stainless steel chape on here, and then these two suspension points, which slide around very easily. That can help you, if you want to actually wear the sword, that'll help you position it for your specific body and how you are wearing it. But it also means they slide around a lot, so it's not going to be quite as secure as if there was strap or risers as a place to have the suspensions sit. The core is wood. It's a very low quality wood core, but it is wood core. And overall, the scabbard looks nice enough. The belt that comes with it is this exact same leather as on the suspension. Very low quality leather. The leather of the actual scabbard itself feels a little bit higher quality. If we look at the fit, it doesn't go all the way in, but I can't really blame the sword or scabbard for that because this is a common thing where I live with the weather fluctuating quite a bit from the transition from summer to winter, which is pretty abrupt here. wood core scabbards tend to fluctuate in their fit as well. So I don't really blame Swordier for this at all. The hilt continues that more ornate thought into the fittings, just like the scabbard. These are both, the pommel and the crossguard are heavily decorated. Now these are very clearly cast with this decoration. If you look close, you can definitely see casting lines, casting flaws, areas that have been cleaned up, things like that. But that's, if you're going to go for very ornate fittings like this, at this price point, you have to do it casting. You certainly can't do that hand chiseled or hand etched or engraved, however you want to describe it. It has to be done through casting. And these are steel or some kind of ferrous material because a magnet does stick to them. I thought at first that they might be like a zinc alloy because they have kind of that look to them, that not that steel look, but more of a zinc alloy look. But the fact that a magnet does react to them says that they are indeed ferrous. The overall design of the pommel is a fishtail, and aside from the casting details, there is some geometry to this pommel as well. It's not just a flat surface. There's kind of a raised midrib. Actually, it's more like almost like a midrib with a fuller in it, and just a decent amount of dimension and design that went into this. All of the corners are chamfered over very nicely. There's absolutely no hot spots here at all, and it works well as if your hand slides down, it works to help stop your hand with this swell here. The peen is here. You can see it. It's a little bit rough. It doesn't fill the entire gap in the pommel, so it could be better, but it is peened over the edges of the gap. So it is a secure peen, at least nothing has come loose, and it doesn't look like it's going to come loose to me. The transitions to the grip there's a little bit of overhang in a few different places, but they're very minor, and again, they're chamfered well, so there's no hot spots. I'm going to skip over the grip to move on to the crossguard and come back to the grip in a moment. Everything I said about the pommel can be said about the crossguard. It's got those same cast decorations, same casting flaws and cleanup and all that kind of stuff. It's got a little bit less decoration than the pommel, which has it on all surfaces. The crossguard doesn't have it on the surface facing the blade or on the surface facing the grip. It's not a big deal, but just something to notice. There's not a ton of dimension to the crossguard. It does start a little bit thicker out here in the center and then taper a little bit towards the quillins, but very minorly. And the corners here are sharp enough that they could they could hurt if you get impacted by them. But in terms of using it, it's not going to hurt the wielder because that's not going to hit me anywhere. Although if you were to do a Mordschlag strike with either the crossguard or the pommel, then these corners would definitely not feel good to the person receiving that impact. The surfaces of the undecorated surfaces here have a very basic polish to them. You can see grind lines a little bit, but it's not too bad. And this right here, again, it could be considered a hot spot, but it's not a problem for me to thumb the blade there, so I wouldn't consider that a hot spot. The recess where the sword sits in the crossguard is relatively small. There's definitely gaps that could be improved, but at a $200 price point, I don't expect anything like this. In fact, I would expect a larger gap here, so this is well done. So let's go back to the grip. This is, without a doubt, the worst part of this sword. It is I believe, leather covering a wood core. And I say I believe it's leather because it is the rubberiest leather I have ever felt, to the point where I actually wonder if it is leather. The listing on Swordier's website does not say what the material is. It is slick. It is a little unpleasant. It's not soft. It's quite hard, but it feels like a thin layer of rubber to me. I'm betting it's just a very low quality imitation leather, but it just doesn't feel good. The shape is very well done. It starts wider than it is thick, and it stays pretty much the same and then tapers in towards the pommel. It's not a complex geometry, but it's effective geometry. The problem is the grip does not give me a good grip on the sword. I can twist the sword pretty easily in my hand, and that's not the shape. Normally it's the shape of the grip that does that. Here it's the material. There's just nothing to really grab onto. It's too slick. So this is by far the area that could use to be improved the most. A better material is going to be a big improvement. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the grip is the primary interface for the user of the sword. This is somewhere that you don't want to skimp. This to me is one of the most important parts of a sword for use, and it's something that a lot of budget makers end up skimping on and kind of not ruining the swords, but making them worse than they could be with just a little bit more investment. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So as you can see, this sword starts at 5.5 millimeters thick and doesn't really taper much at all through the majority of the blade. In fact, it swells up a little bit past the fuller. That makes sense. If you think about the way the fuller is ground in, the blade probably starts as a diamond cross section, and then they grind the fuller in. When the fuller ends, it is still thicker there than after grinding the fuller in. So it makes sense, but it's also not particularly accurate. For a 16A, first off, the blade should actually be hexagonal, not diamond cross section. This is something that a lot of budget sword makers don't get particularly accurate on, but it's one of those compromises. I can see why. That's a more complicated blade geometry overall, and it's not one that's well represented for budget sword makers like Swordier, who were based in China, so they don't really have examples of swords that are done properly for Type 16A. All that to be said, it's not egregiously bad that it gets a little bit thicker past the fuller as opposed to the base. What is not particularly great is that it really doesn't taper from that thickness much at all for the majority of the blade, and then out in the last fourth of the blade or so, it does taper down to 4.5 millimeters, somewhere around there. It's not a lot of distal taper, and it does affect the handling. We'll get into that more during the handling section. The overall finish of the blade is quite nice. It's a satin that doesn't really show much in the way of grind lines or errant marks or anything like that. It's a pretty even satin. Looking down the surfaces, there's some rippling here, but it's quite minor, very shallow, and doesn't really detract from the appearance of the sword. On one side of the edge, up near the tip, there is a very slight wobble in the edge where it kind of dips in just a touch. This was something so minor that I couldn't get it on camera, but it's there, and it's not a problem. It doesn't affect the functionality of the sword at all, but I noticed it, so I wanted to point it out. The tip geometry, like I had mentioned earlier, this is definitely more of a European style tip geometry or blade profile than the Jian-like blade that I reviewed from Swordier earlier. It's overall a nicely done tip. It is pretty even. There's a little bit of asymmetry here, but not a problem at all. The fuller, it does terminate at different points on both sides of the blade, but we're talking less than half an inch, so it's not really a big deal. The beveling is excellent here. It goes from the center ridge to the edge with no trace of a secondary bevel. There might be a very slight micro bevel there, but that's not unusual, and that's frankly to be expected with final sharpening. And the edge it's a little toothy. It could be polished up more, but it is sharp. It is sharp enough to do the job, which we'll talk about during the cutting. But it's definitely a sharp enough edge and good enough geometry to do cutting well. So when I took the sword into the backyard to do some cutting, I put it up against my typical light water bottles, a few bigger, thicker bottles, and a couple paper containers. These are my normal targets. The light water bottles are typically very easy to cut. The bigger, thicker plastic definitely starts skiing harder. Paper containers are actually a really good test of sharpness of the sword, because if they aren't sharp enough, they just either bash the target aside or they cut through and tear. Whereas you really want to see a nice clean cut there. This sword cuts most of the targets very, very well. It's definitely sharp enough to do the job for most backyard cutting. I didn't do any tatami with this. I think it would be okay, but it would struggle a little bit. Your technique would really need to be on point to make this be an effective tatami cutter, because while the edge is sharp enough, it could really use that extra bit of polish, extra bit of refinement to get it to be a better cutter. In addition, the geometry isn't great for cutting tatami because it still stays relatively thick out here. It could use, like I said, to be a little bit thinner. But overall, it cuts the light targets very well. The harder plastic targets, it cut through them very easily. And I did a couple of false edge cuts, worked fine for there. The paper container that I did, it did get all the way through and it was mostly clean, but there was some tearing in there. Part of that, my technique wasn't on point on that cut, but it was good enough. And it did get all the way through. But again, it could use to be just a hair sharper. But at this point, at $200, I can't really complain about that. This is sharp enough to do backyard cutting, and it is a perfectly serviceable edge. It is better than a lot of budget makers put on their swords. It's honestly better than a lot of high-end makers put on their swords. So this is a serviceable edge, and at $200, that's plenty. So how does this sword handle? You saw how it cuts. Let's talk about how it is to move it around. It is 3 pounds, 5.6 ounces, balanced at just under 4 inches. And there is not much flex to it. It is a very rigid blade. And that is because there is very little distal taper, frankly. There is a little bit. It starts at around 5.5 millimeters thick and does end up around 4.5 millimeters, if I remember right. It's a little bit lackluster in the distal taper, especially because the vast majority is still 5.5 millimeters thick. What that does is it creates a sword that has a lot of blade presence, even though it is balanced well. 3 3/4 inches, if I remember right, on the balance point. That's a perfectly fine. In fact, that's a good balance point for a cut and thrust balanced sword. But because there isn't a ton of distal taper here, it just makes the sword feel a little slow, a little clunky, a little dumb. It doesn't feel as dumb as the Windless Sword of Rogan I reviewed relatively recently. It has a little bit more agility, a little bit more movement to it than that sword. It pivots a little bit better, but it doesn't feel great to do anything more than just a basic cut. You know, if you want to start a cut and then redirect, it's a little slow doing that. If you want to try to do something like a double cut, it's a little slow doing that. Everything is just a little bit slow, a little bit clunky. False edge cuts are okay, but again, a little clunky. It's not moving quite the way I want a sword to move. The tip is generally able to be put where I want it, but it's also hard to keep in one spot because it's got a little bit more weight out here. It's got a lot of presence out here. So it just doesn't quite feel the way I want it to feel, the way I want a sword to move around. It's not egregious. It is still easy to do those basic cuts, but it just doesn't want to flow through motions anywhere near as much as the way I like swords to handle. In terms of getting edge alignment, though, it does provide some good sword wind, but it doesn't feel good to stop. You know, when I'm trying to do that, these sword wind tests. I like to throw it out there and stop it so I'm not hitting the floor, right? This sword does not feel good to stop it. The tip wants to keep going and drag down a little bit. Again, it's a little bit weighty out here. Not, again, egregiously so, but it's got a lot more blade presence than you would expect for a sword of its overall shape, design, weight, balance point, that kind of thing. And comparing it to another sword, we have here the Swordier, we have here the Cold Steel Hand and a Half. Now, one of the interesting things, when I grabbed the Cold Steel as a comparison, I picked it up, I'm like, oh, that's a little bit lighter than the Swordier. Turns out they both weigh 3 pounds, 5.6 ounces. It's just that this one felt a little bit lighter in the hand because it actually has a little bit less blade presence, which is saying something, because this sword, with its not particularly refined design, also has quite a bit of blade presence. You can see, though, that the Swordier is a longer blade, and that's doing a lot to create that extra blade presence, that extra tip weight. So that extra blade length on the Swordier, that extra tip weight, actually means it pivots a little bit better than this Cold Steel one does. It's one of the things about this sword that's a little bit weird. It doesn't quite feel the way a sword should feel. It doesn't quite pivot quite the way I want it to. It does work better when I slide the hands apart. I tend to like keeping my hands pretty close together. But if I slide my hands apart, it does pivot a little bit better, but not quite as the way I want it to. And this overall feels more balanced throughout the sword. It is balanced at, that doesn't look too far off the Swordier. I don't have the measurements for this available to me right this minute, so can't say, but that looked about similar to the Swordier. But overall, it just feels a little bit more balanced overall, but a little bit clunky too. In fact, clunkier than the Swordier. Not by a lot, but it's that pivoting that makes it feel a little unintelligent, a little dumb. It just doesn't quite move and flow through the way I expect a sword to do. One thing I'll say is I talked about this grip when I did my review of this sword and how this was not the material here was awful and I hated it. This is still better than the Swordier's grip. I don't like this material at all, but I can't twist it. It gives me just enough grippiness, whereas the Swordier, just not enough grippiness. Real quick, I'm going to go through, I think, only 2 potential improvements that I think could and potentially should be made to this sword right up front. The most important thing is better quality grip wrap. I think it's leather, or I think it's a fake leather and a very low quality fake leather. At least that's what it feels like to me. This would be so improved by having just a decent grade leather wrap on here. It would help keep the grip more secure in the hand. It would feel better. It would just make the sword a lot more pleasant to handle. The second thing would be a little bit improved distal taper. Get it going sooner in the blade. The majority of the blade is pretty much the same thickness. And you generally want that to be smoothed out a little bit more and maybe get it more down to 3 to 3.5 millimeters out this way. This one isn't that bad because while the sword could handle better, it doesn't handle so bad that it desperately needs improvement. It's just something that could be improved. The grip, though, that's really something I think should be improved. All right, bottom line, this sword sells for $199. What do you get for that price? You get a sword that looks the part of a longsword with some very ornate castings for the fittings, a scabbard that is more ornate than you would typically see, a sword that is sharp enough for backyard cutting with a very serviceable edge, and overall a fun sword to use even if it doesn't quite handle the way I would like it to handle. Is it worth the $200? Yeah, I think so. It's probably not what I would personally buy. To me, the decorations kind of go over the top a little bit from interesting to look at to a little bit gaudy, but that's just my taste. and the handling is just a little bit dumb for me, but it's not awful. It's a decent sword at a very attractive price. And it's great to see Swordier continue to evolve. I've seen, since I received the sword, I've seen them put up some videos of newer models where they have improved the grip leather. And they seem to be very receptive to feedback and improving. And that's great to see. It's amazing to see new, I won't necessarily say new, but makers that are pushing into the market for budget European longswords and arming swords as well. It's great to see makers push into that market, and the more makers you have, the more competition there is. Competition raises the level for pretty much all makers. So that's a boon to the end user, to the people who are trying to buy swords. So all that being said, I think if this sword really does appeal to you, especially aesthetically, absolutely it's worth it. $200 is not a lot for a fully functional European style longsword. And if you like the looks of this one, I'd say go for it. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say thank you to Swordier for sending me this sword to review. For my viewers, I have another Swordier longsword, which is going to be reviewed in the coming months. But my very next review is the Tamashigiri katana from Swordier in collaboration with Sword Buyer's Guide. That's a review you're not going to want to miss. Until next time, Alien Dude out.